Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first session of Transform, Rinse, Repeat. This is a monthly series of real-world stories on how executives navigate their companies through disruption. In Deloitte's 2021 Global Resilience Report, a vast majority of C-suite executives, 70%, did not have complete confidence in their company's ability to pivot and adapt to disruptive change. Therefore, we think it's important to have a dialogue with those who are successfully navigating and executing transformation programs. My name is Anne Kwan, and I'm excited to be your moderator today. Within Deloitte Consulting, I serve as our US lead for transformation strategy services. And within the market, I advise executives on how to define their transformation ambition, the corresponding strategic choices, and then the roadmap for execution. I'm joined today by my collaborators and friends, Scott Kelly and Rich Nanda. Would each of you gentlemen please introduce yourselves? Maybe we start with Scott, since you're on the left.
Yes, happy to do so, and great to be here, Anne. Thank you. My name is Scott Kelly. I'm heading up digital strategy at Hewlett-Packard. Also spent a considerable amount of time as a consultant in the transformation space, and most recently was the Chief Transformation Officer with a company called Hitachi Vantara. Nice to be here.
Scott, thanks for joining us, and thanks for moderating. My name is Rich Nanda, colleague of Anne's here at Deloitte. I have responsibility for our Monitor Deloitte strategy practice, including our strategic transformation services. And in the market, I serve consumer products clients and retailers, all about how they pivot their organizations to achieve growth and advantage through transformation of their capabilities. We're excited for this series, and back to you, Anne.
Well, it's wonderful to be here with both of you. Welcome. As you know, we'll tackle a few specific topics today, and then we'll field some questions from our audience. So I encourage everyone who's listening to submit questions, and we'll do our best to address them in the flow of the conversation. So let's start with the definition of transformation, because it means different things to different people. I typically delineate little t from big T transformation, with the former being a change that happens as a part of business as usual, and the latter being a more fundamental change in what value a company offers to its customers and or how that company configures itself to deliver the value. So for example, a shift from being a products company to being a services company would constitute big T transformation in my book. Scott, how do you think about transformation?
Yeah, thank you, Anne. I think it's a great question. Transformation is a word that's often overused. I like your description of big and small T. I tend to think more in big T terms. So enterprise transformation really for me is a sustained and permanent change in what a company offers and how a company offers its solutions, capabilities, and insights to its customers and partners. So I think when I think transformation, it tends to merit the title if it is an enterprise transformation, which affects every part of the business, clearly through the value chain as we differentiate business models to enhance those offerings to customers and partners.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Rich, how do you think about it?
Yeah, I also appreciate the big versus the little t, and I agree with Scott that the big T will tend to be those enterprise transformations, that have a few criteria. They're C-suite type of changes to the company. They're likely going to converge across multiple functions. They're going to converge multiple technologies with business to achieve kind of outsized outcomes. I do think, we're in an environment, though, where the mix of big T's and little T's happening in sequence and oftentimes in parallel is going to increase. And so, companies that are more adaptive and more capable of, big T and little T transformations to achieve value, those are the ones that will, continue to thrive into the future.
I'm going to pick up on what you just said about the kind of the merging and additional transformation happening at a faster rate. What are some of the catalysts that signal a transformation is necessary? Scott, would you like to take that one?
Sure. So I think what I've tended to see is that the customer needs are changing. So typically organizations are responding to the needs of the changing requirements from their customers. I also tend to see that there's quite an internal focus rather than that outside-in focus from organizations that really are prompted to transform. And then I think there's also significant lack of insight from data. So the data question comes up. I think organizations really struggle to provide insights and really be data-led in their decision-making. So there are three examples that we tend to see. I think the other one is from a people or talent capability perspective. Organizations or CEOs may want to move into different spaces and discover that they really have the opportunity to pivot their business model, but they really run out quickly on the type of talent who understands X as a service and really understands how to set up innovation in a transformation environment.
Right. So it sounds like you've given us some ingredients for designing a transformation strategy with the data, the people, et cetera. Rich, would you like to talk about your perspectives on how you typically design a strategy around transformation?
Yeah, and look, I agree with Scott completely that the customer centricity is at the heart of a lot of the transformation need for companies. And one of the big reasons there is the continued digitization of our economy, how that's changing, how products and services interact with customers and consumers, and because of that, traditional ways of creating value are potentially less appealing to those customers, which invites new players in to create value in a different way. And so it's changing the competitive landscape for how we can build advantage and scale around our customer needs. And then as that happens, I think this need to really think about strategy, how the company is generating value over the long term is really important, right? And transformation for transformation's sakes is can be a big problem. Transformation, how we adopt digital and technology into the organization, it has to be hand in glove with how we're choosing to compete and generate value over the long term. And so I think management teams that are very clear about the strategy and how big changes the adoption of technology fits into that strategy, those are the teams that I find are the most effective at harnessing transformation.
Right, that makes sense. What we've seen is that disruption is coming in shorter and more intense cycles. So how do you prepare your organization to respond? How do you build those transformation muscles?
Yeah, and I'll take that. I think part of this really needs to come from the discourse from the CEO and the executive suite. I think we're just to build on what Rich has mentioned. I think the CEO needs to take a very important role in driving that continuous kind of change communication, and really showcasing what the requirements are, role modeling some of those requirements, and identifying those across the organization, and really keeping focus on it. This isn't something that's one and done, and it kind of goes back to that original question you asked, Anne, about big and small T. Rich is exactly right. Transformations really need to be strategy led, and that's really about how you pivot the enterprise. But there's so much of that short burst transformation that needs to be within the genuine guardrails of that strategy, and needs to be dynamic because customer needs are changing as well. So I think it's really about setting the context across the entire organization, not to be steady state, to look to kind of continuously self-disrupt, look at what's horizontal in terms of new capabilities that are coming out and how the company can utilize those, and really make the bent towards innovation for the organization, and make that innovation across everything from business models and process and technology, and ultimately what businesses we are in. So I think that's that role of the CEO and the executive suite, that framing of how this is not a one and done. It's going to be a continuous medium of how we do things, investing in capability that understands horizontal disruption, and then really having the skills and the talent that can kind of interpret that for your organization, are some of what I think makes organizations adapt very well to this.
Right. That makes sense.
And one maybe build on that, and I'd love to get Scott's thoughts on this too. But in many ways, the year we've just come out of, 2020, was incredibly disruptive. Of course, there was the health and human toll of that disruption. But in the business sense, the virtualization of our work and our economy had profound implications on business. And what's been interesting is there's many lessons from that acute disruption that I think are positive lessons learned that companies should bring forward into this next normal, where there will be more acute and pronounced disruptions, whether those are economic, geopolitical, but then there'll also be this more continuous chronic disruption that comes from maybe smaller places. But regardless, the intuition, the risk taking, the ability to adapt and change under extreme conditions, there's lots of nice lessons there for leadership teams and organizations to carry forward. And Scott, I'd just be curious if you've seen any of that, and how's HP dealing with the pandemic and now the post-pandemic realities in terms of its ability to change?
Yeah, and I think across all industries, I think we've seen that type of impact, Rich. I think it's been a huge lesson in adaptability. I think it's kind of accelerated that question about could organizations remote work through necessity, and what it shows is it's remarkable what any organization can do when the situation is forced upon them. I think the key lesson for me, for HP and Telenav and other organizations that I've worked with is, how do you continue to stimulate that type of adaptability in your organization without the external perturbation, without the external change? And I think massive things have been achieved. We've already seen this as an incredible period for innovation. Just over the course of this last year, if you think about even warp speed and so on, just incredible things have happened that we never thought were possible. And I think that is part of what really excites me with respect to transformation. It's just the art of the possible when it comes to innovation and when it comes to what you might be able to do, both with your organization, whether it's your solutions, your business models. And I think it's really down to the imagination and the cultures and what we allow our employees to kind of go off and invent for themselves. So that citizen-led component, I think, is become extremely powerful. I hope that continues post-COVID, and we don't try and elastic band back to kind of how things were. I know there's going to be a certain element of the population that want to do that. I think this has been a schism and a change that I hope will continue to drive significant innovation in ways that we work going forward.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ann.
No, I was just going to say, absolutely, 2020 was a year of catalysts in more ways than one to have people focus on transformation.
Yeah, in some ways, I think Scott, you obviously work a lot in the Valley and with technology companies and practices, mostly with technology companies as well. I think in some ways, other companies have learned, right, in this last year how to behave more like tech and TMT companies in a couple of ways that I've observed, kind of having a view across sectors. But just the comfort with the tech fluid of the entire C-suite and leadership team has become an imperative in a way that maybe was intuition before. But for a TMT company, the technology is the business, so there's always been this comfort and savviness. But I feel like that's happening in other sectors now, as you think about digital health, kind of how e-commerce has grown so significantly. It's coming into other channels and sectors. And this link back to some of the comments I was making earlier of the digital strategy and the business strategy need to be cohesive or potentially one and the same. And I think the most savvy companies that can harness technology, are increasingly making them one and the same. And then that sets the transformation agenda and builds the innovative muscles, Scott, that you were referring to.
Yeah, I think that's a super insightful point, Rich. I think what I've seen is increasingly, as organizations aggregate around what they need to do from a technology perspective, it then says, well, okay, how do we want to offer this to our customers, or indeed new customers? And often I think the balance is you need folks that understand your core business, of course, and you need a healthy balance of people who understand intimately the technology of disruption and the technology of surrounding new business models. And I think that that kind of balance, what you tend to see with the digital strategy component, is it becomes not more than an enabler. It really becomes the kind of North Star for where the organization's trying to go, because it is changing the business models. It is really educating and bringing an awareness to what's possible. And often that is very different from the business that the company is in, hence the big T transformation. So I think what I see the most successful companies do is really clue into that, to your point, Rich, very quickly. And they aggregate the entire organization around that digital agenda. But that digital agenda is about customer and using that incumbency with customer and potentially new verticals and new customers. And then it's working backwards through the business and operating models and into kind of how the company manages all of that through its enabling technology. So I think that's where the link becomes. Big T for me is that component of business model and existing customers with new insights and new capabilities and new solutions, but also new verticals. And that then defies some of the need for the existing legacy businesses, which transformation is about altogether anyway. So yeah. I think it's a great point.
It's funny, as again, I just love this dichotomy sometimes between tech companies and non-tech companies. But Scott, you're talking about new verticals as new customers to acquire and new markets to enter. But for somebody, that new vertical is the incumbency, and that's the disruption that's coming in, right? So one company's new vertical is another company's
absolutely.
disruptor. So back to your disrupt yourself.
100%. I think we saw that in the press just a day or two ago with a very well-known founding Silicon Valley company. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So can we talk a little bit about success factors? In your experience, what have been some of the key ingredients to architecting these complex transformation programs?
Yeah, I think for me, from a success factor perspective, these sound like somewhat hackneyed terms, but I think having, CEOs or executive suites very aligned. What I tend to say is the enterprise agenda needs to become everyone's agenda in a way that it never has before around transformation. So I think a clear success factor is having the leadership team really understand, having the right leaders, first of all, who understand the change that is underway and have some experience of this. Having those leaders aligned so that the messaging they drive across their organizations is consistent and true to the enterprise need. I tend to be a big believer that digital transformation is about people. It's people transformation ultimately, in bringing in new capabilities to your organization, defining new ways to innovate, and then building the capabilities of your existing workforce as that parlays into the new. So I think some of the success factors for me is just how aggressively you manage the communication process and alignment process. It may sound very subtle, but it's super important, both internally and externally. I think the other success factor is you have to be bold. You have to really be prepared to make statements, to your shareholders and really build that commitment and that viewpoint internally and externally, so you can hold yourself accountable for the significant changes that you need to make. And you need to be able to show quick successes. Another huge success factor is a lot of people criticize that transformations talk, and we see that in a lot of the organizations who don't manage to pull it off. But showing quick returns and showing how things can be different, not only presenting opportunities for your employees and teams, but also showing up differently for the customer with different insights and different capabilities and different solutions, I think is super important. So moving fast, being agile, and really kind of staying the course. This is a marathon, not a sprint. We often refer to transformation as being multi-year, and then it just continues. So making sure that you have the stamina and the right people with the right stamina to push through. And then, the final thing, and where some of my lessons learned have been, is build enough of a tipping point in terms of the new capabilities that you need quickly enough. Otherwise, it becomes extremely difficult to sustain a transformation in order for it to be successful. They would be some of what I would offer.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you. The right narrative, being bold in the ambition. Otherwise, it's just going to be an incremental change. And then proof points and MVB capabilities. So you've got something that concrete that you can point to and build upon. So absolutely agree. So Rich, I know our research suggests that success is correlated to two key dimensions. One, a company's strategic positioning, and then two, a company's capacity to change. Those who rank favorably on both are often recognized for resiliency with valuations that reflect that potential. Would you like to elaborate on some of that research? Because it actually touches upon some of the things that Scott just cited.
Yeah. Thanks, Ann. So yeah, spot on, right? A company's capacity to compete and a company's capacity to change and adapt, right? We've seen those are two key criteria of what's driving valuations. So if you have a high capacity to compete and a high capacity to adapt, there's not only high valuation, but there's also less volatility in that valuation. So companies that have a high capacity to compete but can't change, they can achieve a high valuation, but there's a lot of up and down. They're susceptible to swings. And so, it's having that North Star and a real understanding of your customer and how you build moats around those customers, that competitive advantage. But then this idea of, being able to change and adapt is really important. And there's four characteristics that we can boil that down to through some research that we've done. One is nimbleness. So how quickly do you respond to changes and take advantage of those? The second is scalability. So it's one thing to be nimble, but it's another thing to then react and then achieve some scale and volume behind those changes. The third then is stability. So can you withstand duress, and is there some permanence to your capacity to change? And then the last one's optionality, right? So through how you've configured your organization, your leadership team, are you continuously evaluating new options for capabilities to bring into the business or ways to go to market? And so those four characteristics seem to be very defining around an organization's capacity to change. And if I could just spend one more second on optionality and tie it back to Scott's critical success factors that he was describing. One other way to create optionality and also achieve the success factors that Scott was talking about is know that the innovation that a company requires is more than likely not going to come from inside the four walls. And so how do you tap into a broader set of potential partners to build new ways to go to market, new ways to compete? So really thinking about your those capabilities that are needed and as integrated people, process, technology stacks, and knowing that you're not going to build that capability stack and innovate new ones within the four walls. So how do you create a bit of an open mindset to partner and find partners, big and small, that can help you win into the future?
Right. I mean, that's a great point, because you're really kind of revolutionizing the company versus just evolving it kind of business as usual. And so you're not necessarily going to know how to do that just because it's not something you do every day. I wanted to take a couple of questions I see in the chat here, and I think link back to some of the comments that we just talked about. So there's a question around how do you get leadership to be open to transformation? And I know that we talked about architecting that ambition and being bold. What are some ways in which you've talked with executives to get them to articulate what is their transformation vision and help get them over the line in terms of deciding that this is something they need to do now?
Yeah, and I think it's a great point. I think using data to oftentimes leaders don't feel there's a burning platform, even though there is, right? And if you talk to your investors or the analysts, you start to see the signals of that very early. So being tied into what is happening in the market is super important, and understanding where those disruptions are coming from. I think what I would always advise is kind of get a compelling, so mission-led or purpose-driven, whatever you want to call it, vision for how you want to transition the company, because it needs to really kind of appeal to the hearts and minds of your executives and of your teams, because ultimately they need to believe and really kind of get religion, if you like, about what you're trying to do organizationally. So this idea of really creating a higher purpose for your organization gives a very strong imperative, often when there isn't a felt burning platform, which is quite the same. I think the other things are, recognize that leaders particularly really need to lean in. So what you're looking for as a CEO is you're looking for your leaders to lean in. So this openness to transformation becomes non-optional, or really should become non-optional from a CEO's perspective. I've seen some organizations really, really struggle when it just requires one important leader not to be behind the mission and what you're trying to do, and then CEOs and boards need to take action. You need to have a leadership team, as I mentioned before, that's aligned and committed to driving the transformation. Otherwise, there is a risk that, and we see plenty of evidence of this, that organizations won't survive. And I think if you're not disrupting, then you're in the position of the least likely to survive. It may take some time, but you can't let individuals stand in the way of that. So in summary, create a compelling vision, make sure you get the right alignment and the right people on board for that alignment. There's a huge responsibility in the CEO in terms of driving that and creating that compelling vision, and then making sure that you're spending that balance of time, internal and external, with your messaging. One of the points that Rich made a second ago is, you can't transform just by spending your time within the four walls. You really need to have a massive amount of time that you're spending internal and external. And it doesn't fit within the confines of how you would typically have done your working week before you decided to transform. There's just a huge physical effort that's required from the leadership across the organization, and that's not something to be underestimated.
Right, absolutely. There's a lot of change management, a lot of expectations management that happens within your four walls and beyond. There's some questions from the audience around the composition of the team, the skills, the traits that you look for when assembling a team to tackle transformation. Would either of you like to address that question?
Sure. I think I would say, maybe just to build on what I'd mentioned, I think there are specific skills, that are important. There's also a lot of attributes that are very important too. I think the skills are, experience in SaaS typically, and experience in kind of disrupting business models is super important. I think coming, as we know, this is if you're in a products organization, you're trying to move hardware to software, whatever your transition is, having exposure to both becomes critically important, because you can't have all of your team learning all at once. So I think that's a vital component that's often underestimated with regard to leadership and CEOs as they're going through. You can't make the change, the transformative change we're describing, often with the leadership teams that you have. It's just impractical. I think in terms of attributes, though, I think the point I made a second ago is, this becomes a huge undertaking for organizations and for leaders. So they need to have, plenty of humility to learn. They need to have plenty of patience, because the process can take time. They need to have plenty of energy. I also say that you need to dispense with how you were doing business before, when your organization was running quite smoothly and quite mature. You really need to get across the organization. We talked about internal and external before, and so leaders need to show up very, very differently when they're going through a transformation, because the successful leaders are the ones that really are, traveling when we could, to, if it's a global organization, but really getting those one-on-one conversations and one-to-many conversations, understanding the concerns and really allaying the fears and concerns around transformation, and leading, filling the vacuum that gets created through transformation by being a true leader. And oftentimes you either see leaders shy away from that or continue to just do business as usual. That will be unsuccessful. So I think, again, that's some lessons for CEOs to think about, having the right personalities, and for leaders to really show up differently, because it's challenging. It's very challenging to run a successful transformation.
Right. Absolutely. Rich, anything to add in terms of the type of attributes or skills that you look for?
Maybe I'll just offer two, and I see a whole bunch of questions starting to come in. So we've got our work cut out for us here in the second half. So one is stamina, and I think Scott has kind of referred to it a couple times. And I think that stamina has to be tuned for the specific organization. Like what stamina looks like in one company, may be different than another. Some companies have resources to staff large, program offices. Others, don't. And so stamina in a company without a large transformation office or scale may mean, those executives have to be in the trenches a bit more, and be the driving forces for change. So stamina, but tuned to your company's size, scale, complexity, and culture, would be one. And then this idea that the enterprise agenda is every executive's agenda is really important. And there can't be a they and we mindset. You often see that they, we show up in the business and technology. That is something that, still permeates way too many companies, functional, regional kind of views of it. There really needs to be one enterprise agenda, and the team needs to be, working cohesively as a team, because these big changes can't get done in functional or regional or capability oriented organizations. They have to be stitched together across the enterprise.
Right, exactly. And then since you touched on stamina, I'm going to pick up on this question around fatigue. Transformations are multi-year, they're long. How do you address the inevitable exhaustion that creeps up as you head into your second year of transformation?
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful question, and I actually think the answer that I'll give may surprise you a little bit. I think fatigue is inevitable. So I think, but fatigue gets exacerbated where you don't have a purpose-driven agenda or a mission-led transformation that's aligned to, as Rich mentioned. So I think it's really about avoiding at the front end, really having people clearly understand why you're transforming, what's the benefit for the company. It could be as simple as survival to really being growth, because I always think about big T about being about driving a growth agenda, typically into new business models, into new capabilities and new solutions. So I think it's very much about that understanding of fatigue will be inevitable. So, leaders and organizations need to build in time, specifically be very thoughtful about how they take steps back and really kind of refresh, much as we've had to do during the COVID environment. I think it's become organizations need to be very thoughtful about that. So whether it's kind of refresh days or wellness days or what they do to signal that they understand that fatigue is going on and to continue to help refresh. But most importantly, I think it's about accepting it will happen, and really what gets folks tapping into their own discretionary effort and being able to bounce out of bed in the morning and be very excited about transformation is how well it's defined and articulated, how they feel benefit for the companies typically that they love and want to be successful, and what it means in many respects for them. So I think it's like being purpose-led and mission-led, understanding that can benefit your community and the environment and so on, and really kind of showing up well at the articulation point, definition point of your transformation, as well as being thoughtful during are some of the options that I've seen successful companies adopt.
Right. And I would bring up your earlier point around having proof points along the way so that you can celebrate success. Yes. And remind people that, we are making progress. There's some ways to go, but look at all the things that we've already accomplished. So
absolutely. And I think maybe if I just riff on that for momentarily, I think, CEOs need to make sure their leaders can execute and show those quick wins. I think the risk is that the organizations feel it's been talked about, and then you lose everyone if they don't see those quick wins. And that requires a very high execution quotient amongst the leadership as they go through the transformation.
Yeah, I think this idea of purpose, so that it's not transformation to implement, yet another thing, but it's actually progressing the interests of the company, for all stakeholders, that gives the real esprit de corps. And then progress, right? Wins. We're multi-year journeys. You can't wait for the finish line, right? To celebrate and make progress. And so these journeys have to be architected with, monthly, quarterly, kind of signposts of progress, that the enterprise can celebrate internally and externally.
Right. So speaking of progress, there's also a question here around measuring success. And so thinking about, how to define qualitative or quantitative things to celebrate. Would you guys share some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, and it depends somewhat in terms of what your transformation, whether it is that big or small T, of course. But at the enterprise level, I think it's really what I look for in those initial stages is what the analyst, and investor feedback is around your transformation. Is it compelling enough? Is it really capturing the imagination? What your internal metrics are like. So is there alignment? Do people understand? So think employee surveys internally, if you will, and however you gain that information from your own workforce, because if the employees don't understand it, your chances of being successful are very, very slim. I think then when we look at the customer, I think if you're moving into new business models, it's really how you're building your demand gen. It's really how customers are determining awareness about your new capabilities and solutions. It's really about how you're measuring some of those other X as a service kind of standard metrics. So I think they're just some of the key ones, but it's a balance, I think, of hard and soft metrics across the organization, both again, internally and externally, that really you need to kind of build that portfolio dashboard and really be measuring all of those kind of key components.
Yeah, I think laddering up the transformation objectives to the enterprise objectives and just making sure those things, and maybe it's one and the same, and the transformation will move the needle very directly on earnings growth or on customer, key customer metrics. But if they don't, then just showing how they connect, and get back to the last question. As the needle moves on those things and the teams see the needle moves, there's this esprit de corps. We did that, right? And when the CEO can say it in a town hall or to the street, and people can see sort of how they made an impact on that, right? I think that's the type of measurement that, again, reinforces the narrative externally and builds a culture that you want inside the company.
And again, I think that point Rich is making about the proximity, or whether it's one and the same, but definitely the proximity of the digital and enterprise strategies is super important, because otherwise they can feel like two different things internally, and you certainly don't want that.
Right.
Right. In my experience, this is something that you tackle up front as you define that purpose or that mission. It's helpful to be very deliberate about what does success mean and get alignment across the executive team and define that set of metrics early so that you can then cascade and track it, as we go. One of the things that we have been talking about is also putting together a dashboard that learns, and so integrating AI and machine learning, et cetera, so that you can, over time, kind of look at patterns and see how you're doing as well. So some next generation things going on here. I'm looking through the comments here, and there's a question around, it's around executive compensation, but I think, we can broaden that to just talk about incentives. So how do you, beyond the mission-led, can set the change management aspects, right? Are there other enablers that we need to put in place so that folks are all marching in the same direction?
I think it's a great point. And I think certainly the alignment piece that Rich and I both talked about can be reinforced through the compensation element for sure. And I think, I always kind of smile when I see organizations doing exactly what they've always done for compensation, yet they say we're going through a massive transformation where everything will be different. That is somewhat incongruent logically. So I think using the levers that you have to be in a position that you can really drive, acceleration. So for me, it's always about how you can accelerate time to value, time to money. And that really is about how you can change the behaviors quickly and align those within your exec and the rest of the organization. I've seen significant incentives presented on the achievement of milestones, which I think really, and if you have an aligned agenda, that's fine because everyone is moving in the same direction. Again, making these digital transformation goals for all of the execs the same, or at least the same in terms of the portions that they own, is super important in accelerating that alignment and the achievement of what you need organizationally. If you don't change those, there's a high risk that they'll stick to doing what they've always done, and that will slow down your transformation overall. I think the other thing I would offer is, successful transformations whilst there are less of those than probably ones that fail to meet all of the goals, become real defining points for individuals' careers in terms of what they learn. So being part of a team that's been recognized as driving a recognized transformation is a hugely important thing for your career sustainability and what happens next, whether it's internal to your organization or beyond. And don't forget, you're learning just incredible skills as you go through that transition, which will serve you for the rest of your career as well.
I love that point, Scott, that transformation is definitely an accelerator of experiences, right? You accumulate a lot of experience in a shorter period of time, which makes you a more valuable, employee to a lot of potential employers.
Right. I was actually just talking to a client about how the Transformation Management Office is somewhat of an incubator of talent, right? And people, exactly to your point, is a place that there's high stakes, high visibility, but just high exposure to lots of different parts of the organization. And coming out of that, you're better positioned to take on multiple roles in the organization.
Exactly. Yeah. Same. I think the last handful of companies I've been with, those transformation offices are generally populated with, a lot of high potential talent that then, learns a lot and then can move to many different upward trajectory roles in the organization.
Right. Okay. So then there's one other here around transformation being driven kind of tops down. I think there's a contrarian view, would it be better if it was driven bottoms up? Thoughts on that one?
I think the ideal answer is both. I think you need the challenge a little bit with bottoms up, if that's kind of possible only, and more citizen led, is that senior level alignment and how the organization faces to the rest of the business internally, but also externally, becomes super important. I think it's analysts, shareholders, everyone will pick up if there's boards, if there's any fragmentation in the thought process of your senior leadership. And it becomes kind of in places like Silicon Valley, we can point to organizations that they kind of are or are not aligned because that's just how small it is. So I think top level alignment, and are you driving a genuine transformation which is really supported and invested in and so on, it becomes well known. And that the implication of that is, do other talent decide to join or not? So that's something that CEOs and boards need to think very carefully about. I think you need a bottoms-up component to that as well. The successful transformations are the ones that capture the imagination of the entire organization, really engage, and as we've even seen before, literally thousands of people learning new skills, leaning in, being involved in what's different and how change is made, and doing that on top of the, quote unquote, day job. So I think that both are required, in my opinion, to be successful.
Yeah, there was actually there was an inclusion angle to that question too at the front end, which I really liked. Is transformation that's more citizen led, does that create more inclusive outcomes? And I think it can. And the way Scott described it, I've seen a CEO that creates the North Star and an agenda, but then engages all the employees to say, okay, well then how do we achieve this? What are you seeing? Recognizing that, as Scott said, a lot of the good ideas and innovation will come from different parts of the organization, edges of the organization, and if that creates also a more inclusive set of experiences that are brought to the table, likely to get much better outcomes.
And I think as well, Rich, totally agree. And this aspect of the kind of the squidgy middle. So, when transformation efforts come from the top, it kind of reaches middle management. It's a very well documented process that's where it stops. I think that's why the engagement from the bottom really kind of puts pressure to push through on that kind of middle management audience, who can often be the blockers, or at least the lack of enablement.
Yeah. So time flies when we're talking about transformation. So I'm going to wrap up our conversation today, but I wanted to thank you for sharing your insights, Scott and Rich, and then also thank our audience for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks for moderating, Ann. Scott, thanks so much for joining us. And we'll be back in a month's time, the last Thursday of April. for another energetic and exciting conversation around transformation.
Excellent. Thanks all.